Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Mises versus Marx, Capital and Calculation. Here is what you will get from this episode, fast and clear. First, a crisp comparison between social ownership plus planning and private ownership plus prices. Second, the core mechanism called monetary calculation, the quiet engine that tells us which projects are worth doing and which are not. Third, prices as information, a living signal system that updates faster than any memo. And finally, incentives and the soft budget constraint, the subtle forces that decide whether mistakes get corrected or buried. By the end, you will have a toolkit for seeing how rules shape signals, signals shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. Let's set the stage. We are comparing two different ways of organizing an economy. On one side, social ownership with a plan. Think of a world where major means of production are collectively owned, and a central authority coordinates who gets what and in what quantities. On the other side, private ownership with prices. Here, many owners make separate plans, exchange with one another, and the price system ties those plans together. No moralizing yet, just the architecture. Now the key mechanism, monetary calculation for capital goods. Imagine you are deciding whether to build a bridge from steel or from aluminum, or whether to expand a power plant or lay fiber for data centers. These are not apples-to-apples choices. They involve different materials, different time horizons, and different risks. Monetary calculation converts all those differences into a common yardstick so you can rank alternatives. It is not about money as a fetish. It is about money as a measuring stick for opportunity cost. Without comparable numbers for producers' goods, decisions become stories, not choices. With comparable numbers, choices become testable. You can ask, does this project earn its keep relative to the next best use of the same resources? Closely tied to that is prices as information. Prices are not just tags on a shelf. They are compressed messages about relative scarcity, changing technology, shifting tastes, and evolving risk. When the price of copper rises, it is not merely expensive copper. It is a signal that somewhere, perhaps far away, demand has outpaced supply or new uses have emerged. When the price falls, it may be signaling new deposits, improved extraction methods, or fading demand. You do not need a global briefing to adapt. You need the signal, and you need the freedom to respond to it. That is how millions of plans quietly coordinate without a single meeting. Next, incentives and the soft budget constraint. Incentives decide how people behave when no one is watching and when things go wrong. A soft budget constraint exists when enterprises expect to be bailed out if they overspend or underperform. If losses will be covered, the urgency to cut failing projects fades. Targets are met on paper, but at the cost of quality or future capacity. The accounting looks tidy, the incentives do not. A hard budget constraint, by contrast, makes errors costly for the decision maker. It is painful, yes, but pain is also feedback. It is the system's way of saying, stop doing that. Two more terms will keep us honest throughout this talk. First, the knowledge problem. Knowledge of local conditions, specific know-how, and rapidly changing facts is scattered across society. No one has the whole picture. The crucial question is how a system gets that dispersed knowledge into decisions quickly and truthfully. Second, material balances. This is the method of matching physical inputs and outputs in natural units, like tons, kilowatt-hours, and machine hours, to ensure that plan targets add up. It can work for a narrow set of goods or for short periods, but it places a huge burden on whoever must tally and update thousands of constraints as reality shifts under their feet. Why does any of this matter? Because money and property rights do not just move resources around. They reshape the signals we see, the accountability we face, and the way errors get corrected. Change the rules about ownership and exchange, and you change the incentives to tell the truth, the speed of adjustment, and the courage to cut losses. You also change who bears the consequences. That is not a small detail. That is the moral heart of institutional design. So hold this simple chain in your mind as we proceed. Rules create signals. Signals shape behavior. Behavior produces outcomes. If the rules muffle or distort the signals, then behavior will drift, and outcomes will surprise us in the worst possible way. If the rules amplify accurate signals and tie decisions to real consequences, then experiments happen, errors get revealed, and learning compounds. As we move forward, keep these terms on your mental whiteboard. Calculation, the yardstick. Prices, the signal. Knowledge, dispersed and time-bound. Material balances, the physical spreadsheet. Budget constraints, soft or hard. With these in place, we can evaluate any system without slogans. We simply ask whether the rules make truth cheap to find and expensive to ignore. Marx's end state is clear in its moral intention. The major means of production are to be socially owned, and the long-run goal is a society where need, not status or wealth, determines access. But the road is staged. In the lower phase, distribution still tracks one's contribution, with deductions taken for common purposes like investment, reserves, and social services. Only in the higher phase does the famous line come into view, from each according to ability to each according to needs. That vision is the beacon. The question for us is the mechanism. Let's slow down and separate two problems that often get blended together. One is the distribution of consumption goods. Who gets bread, clothing, housing, medical care, and on what terms? The other is the allocation of capital across uses. Which factory gets rebuilt this year? Whether to expand a power plant or a rail line. Whether to invest in steelmaking or in agricultural machinery. Marx is eloquent on the first problem's moral horizon. He is comparatively quiet on the second problem's day-to-day arithmetic. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx sketches a transitional arrangement where labor certificates could track how much one has contributed, net of those social deductions. It is a picture of fairness anchored to effort rather than market income. But notice what is missing. A worked-out method for comparing very different investment choices across time. A rule that tells us, in practice, how to trade off more housing this year versus more machine tools that raise output 3 years from now. How much cement should flow to bridges versus schools? What is the common unit that lets us rank these plans when money prices for producers' goods are set aside? Marx assumes that once class antagonism is removed and property is socialized, the main source of conflict dissolves. But does it? Even in a world with aligned class interests, scarcities remain. There are still not enough skilled workers, land, copper, or transformers to do everything at once. Scarcity forces choices, and choices demand comparability. If the unit of comparison is not spelled out, decision-makers must rely on administrative judgment, political priority, or moral claims about urgency. Those can be sincere. They can also be inconsistent. To be fair to Marx, his project was not a technocratic handbook. He was diagnosing a historical process and a social structure. He expected the concrete techniques of coordination to emerge when the material conditions ripened. Still, that leaves a gap that matters. The blueprint names the destination and sketches the ethical neighborhood of the first stop, but the engineering drawings for capital allocation are thin. How, exactly, should a planning authority choose among thousands of rival projects? By engineering feasibility alone? By labor hours? By physical output targets? Each proxy hides different trade-offs and different risks. Think about what happens when we ask practical questions. If a new synthetic fiber reduces the need for cotton, who captures that information and how fast does it redirect investment plans? If a region discovers that its soil quality demands different machinery than expected, what process converts that local knowledge into a revised plan next quarter, not next decade? The texts are powerful on social purpose. They are sparse on the updating rules that connect local facts to large-scale choices. So, Marx gives us a moral horizon and a theory of social conflict. He outlines a transitional distribution principle that is stricter than need and gentler than wages as we know them. What he does not give is a detailed calculus for investment in a world of heterogeneous capital and time. That is not a criticism of intent, it is an observation about method. And when the method is unspecified, we are left to ask what unit, what signal, or what process will take the place of the invisible arithmetic we rely on when comparing unlike things. Here is the heart of the challenge in one line. If you remove markets for capital goods, you remove the very yardstick that lets you compare one plan to another. Without that yardstick, rational economic calculation becomes guesswork dressed up as confidence. Let's make this concrete. Suppose you must decide whether to build a bridge from steel, or from aluminum, or to forget the bridge and upgrade a rail corridor instead. Each option uses different inputs, arrives on different timelines, and changes what you can do later. How do you rank them without a common unit? Engineering can tell you whether each design would stand or fall. It cannot tell you which design is the best use of scarce resources when there are thousands of competing projects. The missing piece is a way to translate unlike inputs and future payoffs into a comparable scale so that better and worse are not just opinions. In everyday life, that translation happens through money prices for producers' goods. Those prices do not fall from the sky. They crystallize from millions of exchanges among owners who face real trade-offs and bear real consequences. When those exchanges are abolished for the means of production, There is no longer a live market for steel mills, turbines, transformers, machine tools, or land in alternative uses. Without that market, you lose the very numbers that summarize the opportunity cost of using those items here rather than there, now rather than later. Why does that matter? Because planning is triage. Every plan says yes to some projects and no to others. Saying yes to the bridge means saying no to something else that might have delivered more value per unit of input. If you cannot measure the something else, you cannot know what you just gave up. You can still choose, of course, but you are choosing blind. The more complex the society, the more costly that blindness becomes. Notice the distinction between technical feasibility and economic feasibility. We can design a dazzling factory that makes the strongest cable on Earth. Technically feasible. But if the inputs it requires crowd out 10 other projects that would have served people more, then in economic terms the dazzling factory is a mistake. Market prices for producers' goods give us the warning light before we pour the concrete. They let us perform ex-ante comparisons, not just post-mortems. Without those prices, warning lights go dark. Mistakes announce themselves only later, as shortages here, bottlenecks there, and silent opportunities that never materialize. You might say, can't administrators just collect all the data and do the math? They can collect a lot, and they often do. But the numbers they need are not just volumes and coefficients. They need the counterfactual value of inputs across all alternative uses, right now, in a world that is changing. That counterfactual value is exactly what a live price system condenses. It is not perfect. It is responsive. It is constantly being tested by profit and loss, which are simply the system's way of rewarding combinations that created more value than they consumed and penalizing combinations that did the opposite. Another way to say it. In a world of heterogeneous capital, the question is never only how to make something. It is whether making that thing is the best use of those particular tools at this particular time. Money prices for capital goods are the way we encode that question and answer it in comparable units. Remove the prices, and you remove the comparability. Remove the comparability, and you remove the test. Remove the test, and error correction becomes political rather than economic. This is not a claim about human virtue or vice. It is a claim about the information content of different institutional settings. Where owners can exchange the means of production, prices emerge that reveal trade-offs otherwise hidden. Where such exchange is absent, planners must substitute rules of thumb and targets that cannot fully stand in for comparative valuation. The result is understandable. More emphasis on hitting quantities, less clarity about whether those quantities are worth producing at all. So the challenge from 1920 lands with a simple question. By what common measure will we rank thousands of rival investment plans when the goods that make those plans possible are not traded? If the answer is, we will rank them by administrative priority, then the nature of decision-making changes. The scale is no longer opportunity cost discovered through exchange. It is preference declared by authority. That can coordinate action. It does not perform the same kind of economic calculation. Think for a moment about all the tiny facts that keep an economy upright. A frost in one valley, a machine down for maintenance in a mid-size factory, a new use for an old alloy, a neighborhood whose tastes quietly shift from consoup to fresh produce. None of these alone looks like a grand event. Together, they are the moving parts of reality. The question is simple and a little unsettling. How do we get all of that scattered, fast-changing, mostly local knowledge into the decisions we make about what to produce, where to ship, and when to stop? Hayek's claim is that the relevant knowledge is not sitting on a single shelf, waiting to be catalogued. A lot of it is tacit. It lives in habits of skilled workers, rules of thumb on loading docks, and hunches formed by buyers who have seen 5 seasons come and go. It is also time-bound. The fact that matters at 9 in the morning may be out of date by dinner. Even if you could write everything down, by the time the report reached the desk of the person in charge, the world that report described would have shifted beneath it. So what carries this knowledge into action? Prices. Not as decorations on a shelf, but as signals that compress millions of tiny updates into a handful of numbers that anyone can read, whether they know the story behind them or not. When the price of copper ticks up, a firm that makes wiring does not need a lecture on mine yields, shipping delays, or a surge in demand from a battery plant. The number tells them to economize, substitute, or postpone. When that same price eases, it tells them that the world's trade-offs have relaxed a bit. The signal is terse. It is also intelligible, immediate, and shared across the entire network. Consider a concrete chain reaction. A drought lowers river levels, barges carry less grain per trip, insurers reprice risk, and freight buyers jockey for scarce capacity. None of the participants sees the whole picture. They do not need to. Capacity auctions a little higher here, grain elevates in cost there, milling schedules adjust, and end buyers swap toward substitutes. The price movements transmit a pattern no single brain could fully assemble in time. Think of it as a real-time language, terse but expressive, that lets strangers coordinate without meeting. Could a central processor collect everything and compute the right answers? In theory, you could try. In practice, today's facts are too granular, too tacit, and too perishable. A central office can gather volumes and averages. What it cannot easily gather are the little fragments that live in people's muscles and routines. It also cannot guarantee truthful reporting when outcomes are detached from responsibility. A clerk pressured to hit a target will round numbers the way the target prefers. A buyer facing profit and loss will round numbers the way survival prefers. Those are different incentives, and they change the information that ever reaches a spreadsheet. There is another layer. Coordination is not just about knowing the current state. It is about discovery. Which supplier can really deliver on short notice? Which input can substitute without wrecking quality? Which shipping route is reliable when the usual port is congested? Markets test these guesses with quick, distributed experiments. A firm tries a substitute. If it works, profit rewards the discovery and competitors quietly copy it. If it fails, loss contains the damage and tells others not to follow. The process is messy, but it learns fast because it lets lots of small bets run in parallel. Notice how little pride there is in this mechanism. Prices do not claim omniscience. They are admission tickets to feedback. They invite trial, reveal error, and keep score. That is the point. When coordination depends on a single plan, the cost of a mistake is big and the pressure to hide it is real. When coordination depends on many small plans, mistakes are localized and the system learns by pruning. You do not need heroics. You need permission to adjust. To see the difference, imagine two dispatchers facing a sudden shortage of truck drivers on a holiday weekend. In one setting, the dispatcher raises offered rates, drivers reshuffle their schedules, and lower-value loads self-select out. In the other setting, the dispatcher freezes rates, posts urgent memos, and assigns loads by priority. The first approach is not kinder or harsher by nature. It is simply better at surfacing the true opportunity cost of scarce time, and it moves that information into the hands of people who can act on it immediately. Hayek's knowledge problem is not an insult to intelligence. It is a description of where knowledge lives and how quickly it decays. The claim is modest and sharp. The crucial facts of economic life are dispersed, tacit, and time-sensitive. Prices are the tool that translates those facts into choices without demanding that anyone see the whole map. When that tool is sidelined, a system does not stop working. It just loses the language that let millions of strangers adapt together on the fly. Here is the clever reply to the calculation challenge. If real market prices for capital goods are missing, why not simulate them? The planning board sets administered prices, listens for reports of shortages or surpluses, and then nudges those prices up or down until the books balance. In other words, copy the logic of a market without the messiness of ownership and profit. It is an elegant idea. Let's see what happens when we open it up. Imagine a national thermostat for prices. Too much demand for steel at the current price. Turn the dial a notch higher. Too little demand for aluminum. Turn that dial down. If every dial moves in the right direction, and you adjust far enough, you could, in principle, land on a set of prices that clears all markets. That is the Walrasian picture in plain clothes, and the Langert-Lerner proposal is to implement that picture administratively. But a thermostat reads a truthful thermometer. Where do the readings come from? From enterprises that must report their conditions up the chain. Now think about incentives. If the reported shortage brings more inputs next quarter, it is tempting to shade the truth upward. If admitting a surplus risks a cut in next quarter's allocation, it is tempting to shade the truth downward. The planning board can threaten penalties for misreporting, yes, but the signal is still traveling through a channel where survival depends on satisfying a target, not necessarily on discovering the cheapest honest way to meet it. There is also the problem of who bears losses. In a simulated market, the board sets price equal to marginal cost to mimic efficiency. But marginal cost is not printed on the raw material. It must be measured inside the firm. If cost overruns will be covered because the enterprise meets an output target, then the internal signal for cost discipline weakens. You can hit the quantity goal and still consume too many inputs. On paper, the plan looks satisfied. In reality, resources were silently wasted. That is the soft budget constraint sneaking back in through the side door. Now consider speed. The try and adjust method imagines a stationary world where you can pause, tweak a price, and wait for the system to settle. The actual world is always moving. New technologies appear, supply shocks hit, tastes evolve. By the time the board has collected reports, debated the right direction, and updated the administered price, the underlying conditions may have shifted again. A simulated price can converge in theory. In practice, it chases a target on a moving walkway. Innovation adds one more wrinkle. Markets reward useful surprises. If a manager discovers a way to use a cheaper input with no loss in quality, that discovery can generate profit and be copied by others. In a simulated system, what is the payoff for the discovery? The board can, in principle, award bonuses. But bonuses depend on what is visible to the board and on budget room. When budgets are soft and targets are the main scorecard, the safest path is often to meet the target with the known method rather than to risk a failure with a new one. Over time, the portfolio of experiments shrinks. What about the big picture? The trial and error of a live market is not a single central loop. It is millions of small loops happening in parallel, with profit and loss deciding which loops replicate. The trial and error of a simulated system is one big loop, with administrative hearings in between. Both can adjust. One adjusts by letting many bets run, quickly killing the bad ones with hard feedback. The other adjusts by gathering reports and revising dials from the center. The difference shows up in how fast the system learns and how expensive its errors are while it learns. None of this says simulated pricing never works. It can work in narrow domains, for short periods, especially when the technology is stable and the number of goods is small. The question is whether it scales to an economy full of heterogeneous capital, rapid change, and strategic reporting. When price is a message and incentive rolled into one, imitating the number without replicating the incentive often changes the message. It still looks like a price. It does not behave like one. So the simulated price idea earns points for ingenuity. It also inherits the central difficulties of information, incentives, and time. To adjust a dial well, the dial must be fed by honest readings, the adjustments must be quick, and the people closest to the action must have reasons to search for cheaper, better combinations. If any of those pieces is weak, the elegant thermostat becomes a wall decoration. Picture a wall-sized spreadsheet where every row is a physical input and every column is a use. Steel in tons. Coal in tons. Electricity in kilowatt hours. Machine time in hours. Now picture thousands of these tables stacked by sector and by region. That is a material balance system. The goal is simple to state and hard to do. Tally up physical supplies. Tally up physical needs. Reconcile the two so that every planned output is backed by the right bundle of inputs, in the right quantities, at the right time. How does it work on paper? Planners begin with target output set by leadership. Build so many rail cars. Produce so many tractors. Generate so many megawatt hours. To make those outputs possible, ministries assign norms that specify how many tons of steel, how many hours of machining, how many kilowatt hours each unit requires. Add up the requirements across all enterprises, compare them to available supplies, and adjust until the books balance. If there is a steel shortfall, you cut some projects or revise norms. If there is an electricity bottleneck, you reschedule all lower targets. The procedure is iterative. Adjust, recalculate, repeat. In practice, the sheer scale is overwhelming. There are too many goods, too many variants, and too many local constraints for a central staff to track with high resolution. Aggregation becomes a survival tactic. You plan in big categories, not fine ones. Steel, not the precise grade a factory's gear teeth actually need. Fabric, not the exact we've required for a durable belt. Aggregation keeps the table solvable, but it blurs substitution. When a plant cannot get the exact input, it improvises. Sometimes the substitute works. Sometimes it degrades quality in ways a spreadsheet does not see. Information also travels through incentives, not just wires. Enterprises know that reporting a shortage may bring a larger allocation next quarter, while admitting a surplus may invite a cut. That creates a predictable shading of reports. Managers hedge by overstating needs, by holding hidden inventories for emergencies, and by timing production to look good on the scorecard. This is how a system without flexible prices develops its own informal buffers. It is rational behavior under the rules. It also makes the tables noisier. Targets themselves change behavior. If the ministry rewards gross tonnage of output, factories respond by making heavier items or thicker gauges because weight is what counts. If it rewards units, factories push out more items in smaller sizes. If the plan emphasizes meeting year-end goals, output bunches at the end of the period in a phenomenon workers called storming. The numbers line up. The quality, maintenance, and logistics do not necessarily keep up. Consider quality signals. In a material balance, the focus is on ensuring that the quantities add up. But quality problems are multidimensional. A conveyor belt that meets the tonnage plan can still slip if its surface finish is wrong. A transformer that meets the piece count can still fail early if a substitute winding degrades performance. These are the kinds of mismatches that show up months later as warranty repairs, idle crews, and cascading delays. The plan's arithmetic did not lie. It just left out too much of the story. Coordination runs through institutions. At the top sits the State Planning Commission setting overall targets. Sector ministries break those targets into subplans for steel, energy, chemicals, and machinery. Below them are trusts and enterprises responsible for meeting assigned figures. The flow is top-down for goals and bottom-up for capacity constraints and requests. In calm times, this can muddle through. In volatile times, the loops become congested. Every change at the top requires rebalancing dozens of dependent tables beneath it, and every local shock forces revisions that ripple back upward. Timing is its own enemy. The world does not hold still while the balances are prepared. A flood takes out a rail bridge. A foreign supplier delays a shipment. A new process reduces the copper content needed for a motor. By the time the updated numbers circulate, yesterday's fix may be today's error. Without a quick way to relay and act on those micro facts, planners lean on rationing rules, priority lists, and exceptions. Exceptions keep production alive. They also undermine the coherence the tables are meant to provide. People do not wait passively inside these constraints. Managers build informal networks to trade favors and spare parts. Enterprises strike side deals to swap inputs across regions. Engineers tweak designs to fit whatever input is actually available, not what the norm assumes. These behaviors are not a moral failing. They are adaptations to a system that must reconcile thousands of moving pieces with coarse categories and slow feedback. The recurring pattern is easy to summarize and costly to live with. Shortages in some inputs, excesses in others, and chronic pressure to hit numbers even when the numbers do not track value well. When the scoreboard rewards volume, volume arrives. When it rewards compliance, compliance arrives. What is harder to reward inside the tables is the quiet work of substitution, discovery, and timely correction. Those are the things that keep complex production resilient, and they are the hardest to encode in a ledger of tons and hours. Think of this period as a natural experiment you did not design, but history ran anyway. First, a system that tried to run on command and requisition. Then, a system that cautiously reintroduced prices and trade. The contrast is sharp enough to study. Under War Communism, from 1918 to 1921, the state faced civil war, foreign intervention, and logistical chaos. The response was sweeping. Grain requisitioning replaced ordinary exchange. Private trade was suppressed as speculation. Factories were nationalized. Rationing schedules replaced markets, and money lost its meaning as inflation eroded its usefulness day by day. When money cannot hold value, people do not plan beyond the next delivery. They hoard, they barter, and they hide what they make. What did that do to output? If you are a peasant facing requisition at fixed terms, you have little reason to bring surplus grain to town. You grow enough to survive, maybe a bit more for insurance, and you keep it close. If you manage a workshop and cannot secure inputs through normal channels, you idle machines, cannibalize parts, and wait. Production becomes lumpy and fragile. Shortages are not mysterious in this setting. They are predictable. When exchange is replaced by command, signals go dark and incentives go sideways. The money breakdown matters for a second reason. Prices, even imperfect ones, are a quick way to learn where goods are wanted and where they are not. When inflation races and official prices are detached from conditions on the ground, that learning stops. The economy drifts toward queues and arbitrage. People spend time searching and standing in line, not producing. Effort shifts from creating value to navigating rules. That is not a moral failing. It is adaptation under those rules. Now comes the turn. New economic policy, beginning in 1921. Requisitioning ends and is replaced by a tax in kind. That change is more than a legal tweak. It means that after paying a predictable levy, farmers can bring surplus to market at whatever terms the market will bear. Small private trade is legalized. Some small enterprises operate for profit under supervision. The state keeps control over the commanding heights like heavy industry, transport, and banking, But within that frame, local exchange reappears. Why does that matter? Because it restores two missing pieces at once. First, it reintroduces a price signal that says, bring grain here, bring timber there, do it now rather than next month. Second, it ties effort to reward in a simple way. If you produce a surplus beyond the tax, you can sell it. If you economize on inputs, you keep more of the difference. Those are not abstract incentives. They are daily reasons to sow more, repair the thresher, reopen the stall in town, and restock the shelves. Stabilization follows. With trade legalized and some budget discipline returning, money can be anchored again. When the currency regains credibility, it becomes useful as a measuring stick rather than a hot potato. As that happens, plans can stretch beyond next week. Merchants rebuild routes. Workshops call back workers. Households save for durable goods. None of this is glamorous. It is the quiet work of a system regaining its bearings. By 1923, many key indicators had moved off the floor. The lesson is not that one decree solved everything. The lesson is that allowing prices and trade opened information channels and restored basic accountability. People could now learn where their goods were wanted and be rewarded for meeting that demand. Crucially, this happened without abandoning the long-run socialist goal. The state still set strategic priorities and held the core industries. But at the margin, the rules changed just enough to let everyday discovery and discipline back into the process. So what should you take from this experiment? When coercive requisition and unstable money replaced exchange, output collapsed and adaptation took the form of hiding and improvising. When partial markets were restored, adaptation took the form of producing and trading. The same human beings, the same land, the same machines, very different rules. The outcomes followed the rules. Picture a system that decides to grow at full throttle, all the time. Heavy industry first. Steel, coal, machinery. The plan sets tall targets, then taller ones, and ties careers to hitting the number. At first glance, that sounds focused and disciplined. But watch what the rules actually reward, and you will see why behavior bends in strange ways. Start with the scoreboard. If you reward gross tonnage, factories will find ways to make goods heavier. Thicker sheet. Bulkier castings. More steel per railcar than users really need. The number goes up. The usefulness does not necessarily follow. If you switch the metric to number of units, the same factories respond by producing more items in smaller sizes, because that is what counts. Again, the number moves. The value may not. In both cases, the target becomes the product. Now look at time. End of month and end of year quotas create a familiar pattern workers nicknamed storming. Production bunches at the deadline as plants scramble to hit the line and avoid penalties. Machines are pushed hard when the calendar demands it, then sit idle while repairs catch up. Maintenance gets deferred until the storm has passed. Inventory piles up in the wrong form at the wrong moment. On paper, the plan is fulfilled. On the shop floor, costs rise quietly and quality drifts. Risk is personal in this world, and not in the way you might expect. When overfulfillment of the plan leads bureaucrats to ratchet next year's target higher, prudent managers learn not to reveal true capacity. They sandbag. They understate what they can do, hold back a little slack, and release it when they must. The result is predictable. Information sent upward is filtered through self-protection. The center sees less than it thinks it sees, and schedules built on rosy reports meet stubborn bottlenecks. Quality is where the costs come due. If the target is tons of output, there is limited room to reward careful tolerances, reliable bearings, or clean welds. Those dimensions of performance are real, but they are not the metric. Enterprises adapt by hitting the number and letting quality slide when inputs do not fit or time runs short. The fallout lands months later as breakdowns, warranty claims, and rework. By then, the accounting has already celebrated a victory. Consider truth-telling. In a setting where missing targets can trigger penalties, and where success invites a harsher target next time, honesty is not the safest policy. Managers hedge by overstating input needs, building hidden buffers, and reporting success narrowly defined by the indicator. Workers learn to spend energy on what is measured, not on what keeps a complex system resilient. None of this requires bad character. The rules are simply stronger than wishes. Financing adds another twist. With investment centrally allocated and losses commonly absorbed, the budget constraint is soft. A project that overruns is not necessarily closed, it is often refinanced to meet the plan. That keeps activity high in the short run, but it weakens the signal to stop doing what is wasteful. In a world of heterogeneous capital, stopping at the right time is as important as starting. When stopping becomes political, errors travel farther before they are corrected. You can see how a nested hierarchy tries to cope. The center sets big priorities. Sector ministries translate them into quotas. Trusts and enterprises juggle allocations and plead for exceptions when the numbers cannot be met with the inputs at hand. Exceptions keep production alive, but they also teach everyone that rules bend for those who push loudest or hold critical links in the chain. Scarce parts migrate toward plants with bureaucratic leverage, not necessarily toward the highest value use. Why did the system choose these targets in the first place? Defense pressures and a desire to catch up fast made heavy industry the symbol of progress. It is understandable. Blast furnaces and turbine halls are visible achievements. But when the scoreboard emphasizes volume and speed, the organization learns to deliver volume and speed. Substitution, careful matching of inputs to uses, and timely abandonment of bad projects are harder to encode in a single directive. They become afterthoughts. Step back and trace the causal chain. Ambitious targets plus administrative rewards create strong incentives to move quantities. Those incentives shape reporting, which shapes what the center believes, which shapes the next round of targets and allocations. Meanwhile, quality problems and maintenance backlogs accumulate out of sight until they break through as outages or missed deliveries. The system is not irrational. It is responding faithfully to the rules it lives under. The result is a paradox. High investment rates and heroic plans coexist with shortages of the very things that end users care about: reliable parts, on-time deliveries, durable equipment. The map is full of factories. The experience on the ground is full of workarounds. And because losses are socialized while targets are individual, accountability for error diffuses. It is difficult to learn quickly when the cost of a mistake is not borne where the mistake is made. What should we learn from this? When targets and penalties dominate, people aim for compliance with the indicator. When price and profit and loss dominate, people aim for customers who return and machines that run. Both worlds have flaws. The crucial difference is where the feedback bites and how soon. In a system built on perverse incentives, the bite comes late, and it lands somewhere else. Think of Yugoslavia as the grand attempt to split the difference. Keep socialism, but decentralize decision-making. Keep planning, but let firms feel more of the breeze from trade. The instrument of choice was the Worker Council, where employees had a say in enterprise decisions, and the political center delegated more autonomy to republics and local institutions. Over the decades from the 1950s through the 1980s, this design pulsed, more decentralization, then a tug back toward coordination, then another push outward again. What did that look like on the ground? Enterprises were encouraged to act, in part, like businesses. They could seek foreign customers, they could negotiate with suppliers, they could decide on product lines with more local knowledge in the room. Price controls were not constant, they arrived in episodes, often as patches when inflation quickened or when distribution snarled. Imagine an economy trying to surf between two waves, one called plan and one called market, without falling off. Now the outcomes. Recurring inflation was not an accident, it was a symptom. When wages and investment commitments rose faster than underlying productivity, prices drifted upward. When price controls tried to pin them down, shortages and queues signaled the pressure underneath. Unemployment did not disappear. It reappeared in regional patterns, with some areas finding work and others falling behind. A map of joblessness would show pockets of stress rather than a uniform picture, a reminder that local conditions never became uniform just because the system wished them to be. Then the political economy of credit. Autonomy is powerful, but it needs discipline to match. If banks and local authorities extend credit based on political ties or employment promises rather than hard project viability, the budget constraint softens. Losses are rolled over. Projects that should be trimmed keep going because the near-term social cost of closing them is too visible, while the long-term economic cost of keeping them is too diffuse. In that world, reported success can coexist with hidden fragility for a long time. This is where reform cycles enter. When inflation or imbalances became too obvious, the center moved to re-centralize, tightening price controls, reasserting coordination, rewriting rules. Then, frustrated by rigidity and bottlenecks, it loosened again, restoring more self-management, more trade leeway, more local discretion. Each swing solved some problems while reviving others. Too tight and the system lost adaptability. Too loose and soft finance and regional gaps widened. Were there gains from autonomy? Absolutely. Local knowledge flowed more readily into product and production choices. Firms closer to customers could pivot faster than a distant ministry. But autonomy without a consistently hard budget tends to drift. If poor choices are cushioned by fresh credit and if price signals are intermittently suppressed, error correction slows. The result is a pattern you can feel even without a spreadsheet: bursts of energy, followed by inflationary heat, islands of success, alongside regions waiting for a tide that does not quite reach them. So the stress test teaches a narrow, careful lesson. Decentralization can invite discovery and better fit between what people need and what enterprises make. Yet if the financial spine stays soft and credit allocation remains political, the discipline that would normally close bad bets never fully engages. The system moves, but it does not learn as quickly as it could. That is not a verdict. It is a description of the trade-off Yugoslavia wrestled with as it tried to combine worker voice, limited markets, and macro stability on the same stage. When people say capital, they often picture a pile of machines. But capital is less a pile and more a sequence. Think of an orchestra or a relay race. Raw materials are transformed by upstream tools, then midstream equipment, then downstream assembly, and only after all those handoffs do we get something people actually want. That sequence is the capital structure. It is made of complementary parts that depend on timing. If one section misses its cue, the whole performance stumbles. Time is not a backdrop here. It is the main character. Many investments are front-loaded with costs and back-loaded with payoffs. Pour concrete today, hope for revenue tomorrow. That means coordination across time is as important as coordination across space. The question is simple to ask and tricky to answer. How long should the production chain be? How many stages should we build out before we learn whether customers actually want what sits at the end of the chain? This is where relative prices and interest rates enter as signals rather than slogans. A relative price tells you which inputs are becoming scarce and which substitutes might be worth exploring. An interest rate tells you the exchange rate between present resources and future returns. When that rate rises, it is a warning that long, delicate sequences are more costly to carry. When it falls, it invites more ambitious, time-consuming projects. These signals do not merely decorate a spreadsheet, they shape the length and composition of the entire capital structure. Why does that matter? Because capital is specific. A blast furnace is not a sewing machine. A turbine hall does not become a bakery oven just because plans change. The more specific the tool, the higher the cost of being wrong about the future. Before you commit to very specialized equipment with long lead times, you want signals that are credible, and you want them early. A live price system and a meaningful interest rate deliver that credibility by letting thousands of small bets test the waters while there is still time to pivot. Now picture a world where the key signals are administrative. Suppose the interest rate is set with a policy goal in mind, and upstream targets are set by quota. On paper, long chains of production can look cheap to finance and easy to push forward. In practice, the risk shifts from economic to political. If customers do not show up at the end of the chain, will the project be written down and shut, or will it be extended, refinanced, and folded into next year's targets? When stopping becomes a political decision, mistakes tend to travel farther before they are corrected. Consider the difference in error correction. In a decentralized setting, a firm that overbuilds midstream capacity gets a quick lesson from profit and loss. It writes down the asset, sells what it can, and exits or repurposes. Painful, yes, but the feedback lands where the decision was made, and it lands soon. In a centrally steered setting, the same overbuild often meets the logic of sunk costs. We have come this far, we cannot waste what we have already spent, so let us add one more complementary stage to make the earlier stages worthwhile. That is how pipelines get longer when they should be getting shorter. There is also the problem of mismatched complements. A plan can authorize abundant upstream output with the expectation that downstream complements will arrive on schedule. If those complements slip, the system accumulates inventories and idle capacity in awkward places. The material balance looks tidy at a distance, but the timing misfires create costs the ledger does not see. In a world guided by prices, those misfires are disciplined by carrying costs and falling margins that press owners to cut losses quickly. Think about option value, the quiet power of being able to stop early. Markets create option value by allowing partial experiments. A pilot line runs, customer feedback arrives, financing tightens or loosens, and managers decide whether to scale up or cut back. The option to stop is real and frequently exercised. In a plan pipeline, the option to stop exists on paper but is harder to use. Stopping requires reversing targets and admitting error across a chain of approvals. That is possible, but it is slower, and the slower it is, the more capital becomes stranded in forms that do not fit new realities. None of this denies that long projects can succeed. Many must. The point is about choosing which long projects and when. Signals that move with reality help us trim or extend the capital structure before mistakes become catastrophes. Signals that move by administrative debate tend to lag reality, inviting overextension during booms and abrupt retrenchment later. The consequence is familiar even if the labels change. Costly retooling, scrapping of half-finished assets, and a persistent gap between what was planned upstream and what downstream users actually value. So the takeaway is practical. Heterogeneous, time-bound capital demands two things to stay coordinated: reliable relative prices that tell us where to economize and where to expand, and an interest rate that honestly prices time. Together, they let decision-makers discover when to start, how far to go, and just as important, when to stop. Remove or dull those signals, and coordination does not vanish. It just leans on targets and hope, which are the most expensive tools in the box. Let's ask the most grown-up question in political economy. Who owns the error? Not the credit, the error. Because wherever the error lands, that is where the truth will eventually show up. Start with a simple chain. A person makes a choice. That choice creates a result. The result is compared to what was expected. Then someone pays the bill. If the person who chose also pays, learning is fast and honest. If someone else pays, learning slows and stories multiply. Consider cost discipline. Imagine two managers deciding whether to switch to a cheaper input. In one setting, if the switch fails, the manager's unit takes the hit. Profit falls. Reputation dips. Future resources shrink. That is painful. It is also clarifying. You learn quickly to test small, measure carefully, and stop when evidence says stop. In another setting, if the switch fails, the loss is absorbed by a general fund and next year's allocation is adjusted by committee. Pain is shared. Responsibility is blurred. The lesson becomes political. The same human being will act differently under those two scoreboards. Not because character changed, but because consequences moved. Now think about honesty in reporting. When budgets are soft and targets are stiff, it is safer to shade numbers than to deliver bad news on time. A factory overstates its input needs to build a buffer. A district understates capacity so next year's target does not rise. A ministry delays acknowledging a shortfall because admitting it would trigger penalties without fixing the bottleneck. None of this requires a villain. It is basic self-preservation. But small distortions add up. Plans built on them become brittle. The truth is not gone, it is late. Incentives also shape creativity. If finding a better method brings a visible reward that your team keeps, experiments proliferate. You try cheaper alloys. You reorganize the shift schedule. You retool a line to reduce waste. If the payoff for discovery is thin, or if success simply raises next year's target with no breathing room, the calculus flips. Why take the risk? Meet the indicator. Protect the team. Wait for the memo. Over time, the portfolio of ideas narrows. Not because people lack imagination, but because the expected value of trying fell below the expected cost of failing in public. Accountability has a moral dimension that spreadsheets cannot capture. There is a kind of dignity in being answerable for your choices. It invites professionalism. It encourages people to say the hard thing early. It trains judgment because judgment is tested. When accountability is diffused, two things happen at once. First, anxiety rises, because outcomes feel random and capricious. Second, cynicism creeps in, because good work and bad work blur into the same line item. In that climate, people play it safe in the narrow sense and reckless in the broad sense. Safe with their careers. Reckless with society's resources. Let's make this concrete with a small thought experiment. Two procurement offices face a sudden shortage of a critical part. Office 1 can raise its offer, reallocate its own budget, and face the consequences in its end-of-year results. Office 2 cannot change price and must petition for an exception. Which office will surface the true cost of scarcity faster? Which office will be tempted to invent a workaround that looks compliant on paper but pushes the cost somewhere else? The structures are doing the thinking for the people inside them. Measurement is part of this story. If an indicator becomes the goal, expect the indicator to rise, even if value does not. This is not a clever slogan. It is a warning label. When credibility rests on hitting numbers, professionals will deliver numbers. If the numbers are well chosen and paired with real consequences, great. If they are proxies that can be met while sidestepping quality or timeliness, then the system will check the boxes while real performance drifts. That is not malice. That is math. What about whistleblowing and course correction? In a world where losses are owned, whistleblowing often aligns with the interest of the unit. The sooner a problem is surfaced, the smaller the loss. In a world where losses are socialized, raising a hand feels like volunteering to take the blame for everyone. The safest path is silence until the issue is too big to ignore. By then, options have narrowed and costs have grown. Finally, remember that incentives are not just sticks and carrots. They are permissions. The permission to tell the truth early. The permission to stop a failing project. The permission to reward the quiet engineer who found a cheaper, sturdier fix. Systems that grant those permissions create room for agency, and agency is how complex organizations stay human. Systems that remove those permissions do the opposite. They drift toward rule following without responsibility, which looks stable right up until it is not. So when we analyze any institution, ask 3 questions. Who bears the loss when a decision goes wrong? Who has the authority to say no early? And who is rewarded for telling the uncomfortable truth on time? If the same person or team sits close to all 3, you will usually see fast learning and resilient performance. If those roles are scattered, be ready for delays, polite fictions, and expensive surprises. Here is the pattern that keeps reappearing across very different times and places. The more a system relies on administered targets instead of live price signals for producers' goods, the more it drifts toward shortages, quality slippage, and slow correction of mistakes. The numbers on the scoreboard can look triumphant, yet the lived experience reveals thin inventories, delayed deliveries, and quiet workarounds. When signals are dulled, behavior adapts to the indicator rather than to value. There is also a counterpattern worth holding onto. When limited markets were reintroduced or widened at the margin, adaptation sped up. Under the new economic policy, once requisitioning gave way to a predictable tax and trade was permitted, production and exchange recovered. Under Yugoslav self-management, more room for local choice and trade often produced bursts of energy and better fit to customers. But where the budget constraint remained soft and credit allocation stayed political, error correction still lagged. Discovery needs discipline to compound. So what follows from these 2 patterns? First, rules are not abstractions. They become signals. Signals become habits. Habits become outcomes. If the rules make truth cheap to find and costly to ignore, societies learn faster. If the rules make truth expensive to tell and painless to defer, the bill arrives late and large. Second, coordination is not a single tool. Prices, standards, and institutions each carry different kinds of information. The question is which mix keeps learning honest when the world changes. Here are 3 open questions to take with you. Can a polycentric structure credibly harden budgets without leaning on private capital markets, or does financial discipline ultimately require owners who bear losses directly? In what domains do non-price mechanisms excel, such as safety standards, shared infrastructure, or commons management, and how can they complement rather than replace price discovery? And which institutional designs best protect the permission to stop a failing project early, reward timely honesty, and preserve room for personal agency inside large systems? None of this asks you to adopt a slogan. It asks you to notice how small incentives scale. A reporting choice here, an allocation rule there, and very quickly a society is either discovering useful surprises or learning to look busy while standing still. If you remember only one chain from this talk, make it this one. Rules shape signals. Signals shape behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Change the rules, and you change the world's experiments. If this analysis resonated with you, I would love your help growing the conversation. Please like this video, drop a comment with the sharpest insight or question it sparked for you, and subscribe to Truth Behind History so you do not miss the next deep dive. If you want to go further, check out my book History They Tried to Erase in the description. And if you enjoy thoughtful, entertaining history that looks under the hood of how systems really work, there is a whole library on this channel waiting for you.